All right, let's get going. Good evening, and welcome to the School of Visual Arts, and welcome to the Department of Design, Research, Writing and Criticism. Very good. My name's Alice, and I'm the chair of the program. And thank you. Few little promotions, advertorial promotions, before we commence with the program. Oops, something happened to our font there. Sorry about that. But I wanted to make sure that you all know we are accepting applications for the program for the fall. So if you know people who are interested, there is a small pink bookmark lying around on desks with the URL, better letter space than that, which you can show to them. Our website is at designresearch.sva.edu. Lots of information on there, as well as videos of other lectures if you're interested in tracking those. I also want to alert you to, this is this is the wrong font, right? This is what always happens when we transfer to another computer. No, it's all right. It's just embarrassing, don't worry. So basically, we are going to have an exhibition, very excited. It's called Exploding Footnotes, and it is going to be featuring the work of our MA and MFA students exploring the research process. So bringing the material that normally lies dormant at the bottom of the page, tucked away behind those mysterious-looking footnotes, big up front and center, and really celebrating that research process. So that's what we're in the middle of planning at the moment. I also want to make sure everyone knows about our summer intensive, which is a 2-week deep immersion into design writing and research here in the department. It's really fun. We've been doing it for a few years now, and a lot of design professionals do it, as well as curators and journalists, all kinds of people who kind of either want to know more about design or want to know more about the techniques of research or writing. I really recommend it. Lots of good, fun field trips and great instructors. Lots of nerding out in archives. So yeah, check that out on our website. It's mentioned on our homepage, so you can see that there. David, you're late. Just let these guys come in. Oh. Okay, no worries. There's a few lectures left in our spring series. We have the fashion theorist and curator Francesca Granata coming up on April 14th. Busy week, actually, because the same week on the Thursday we have design historian Michael Golek speaking here, and finishing up with urban planner Gabriella Rendon on April 21st. So do join us for some or all of those. Okay. God, just ignore the type. All right, so it's quite apt that last week's speaker, Kevin Delaney, editor of Quartz, when talking about the contemporary demographic toward which his online global news publication is targeted, named people who were born in one country but live in another, people like me, in fact, as post-nationals. Our speaker tonight, having been brought up in 6 different countries, I believe, embodies that condition even more thoroughly, I think, than Delaney had conceived. James Goggin has lived in Sydney, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Auckland, Tokyo as well? What's the 6th then? Because I've got London, Arnhem, and now Chicago. Well, anyway, a bunch of countries, bunch of cities. Well, you can cover that when we get to it. I think he takes post-national to a new level. And I know that these interrelated issues of place, non-place, and our shifting sense of identity when we're not tied to a particular nation are of particular interest to James, and issues that he has explored through his work as a graphic designer ever since his time as a graduate student at the Royal College of Art in London, as this series of passport photo colour tests alludes to. And I look forward to discussing this matter in the Q&A, along with others. We'll probably also get to discussing teaching, since James has plenty of experience in this field. Since 2012, since he's been living in the States, he's been a visiting thesis critic for the MFA graphic design program at RISD. And before that, he was course director and teacher at Werkplaats, typography in Arnhem, the Netherlands, also working as a visiting lecturer in history and theory at ECAL in Lausanne, Switzerland. We also may be discussing good old straight-up graphic design a bit. The students and regular Tuesday night lecture attendees know that I don't often or lightly invite designers here. My feeling is that there are plenty of venues to go to hear designers speak. We focus on, bringing curators and historians and writers to talk about their working process. But now and again, I make an allowance for a designer who I think is particularly thoughtful or reflective about their practice, as well as someone who might be incorporating research, writing, and criticism in an interesting and integral way within their work. So James' firm is called Practise, which, as the grammatically attentive will note, indicates both a noun and a verb. And as such, points to the dual nature of the practice I think James's work is all about, polished, professional, and output-oriented on the one hand, but also reflective, research-driven, and experimental. With his wife, Shan James, he designs books, posters, websites, typefaces, and many other manifestations of design for clients at the moment, such as the St. Louis Contemporary Art Museum, Sustainable Chicago 2015, Museum of Contemporary Photography, Chicago, Cranach Art Museum, etc. I hope we get to see some of that good stuff tonight, maybe. Possibly. Oh, well, check his website. Together, he and Shan have launched a children's book imprint called Garden Press, publishing independently and co-publishing with artists and institutional partners, including London's Whitechapel Gallery. James also writes, for a range of international publications and journals. He designs typefaces, mostly distributed by the Swiss type foundry Linatu. And his works are included in the permanent collections of the V&A Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Chicago Design Archive. So James moved to the US in 2010 to take up the position of Director of Design, Publishing, and New Media at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. And I think all of us probably in the States were kind of watching that move and had really high hopes for the museum, having the sort of foresight and, perhaps sophisticated approach to design in making that appointment. James no longer works there, so we will be hearing that story, I'm sure. So anyway, I would like you to join me in welcoming to the podium the post-national extraordinaire, James Goggin.
Wow. Thank you very much, Alice. That was amazing. I can cut out my entire intro now. This is great. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the invitation. And I am especially honored given the fact that you're making a special allowance as a lowly graphic designer to infiltrate your program. And I'm especially pleased to be here because I have actually followed the program I think, since it started. How long have you been going for now? Yeah. So, I was following it with great interest from afar, and it's a kind of program that ideally I think I'd like to just join and study if I was able to at some point. So very pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to the students afterwards, and thanks very much for all coming this evening. So, the title tonight is Theory and Practice in Time and Place. I was really trying to think about how I might talk about my work to this maybe slightly different type of audience here at Design Research. And in general, I often find myself using lectures. Over the years, I've gradually realized that lectures for me are not just something as a kind of separate chore that I undertake as a graphic designer that one has to do sometimes just to present one's work. But over the years, I've gradually realized that they're incredibly valuable tools as a kind of piece of work in and of themselves for me as a designer to actually have an opportunity to maybe get as objective a view as I could possibly ever get, I think, of the work that I do. Just when you're trying to re-edit your work and think about how you're going to present it to an audience, puts oneself in a very interesting frame of mind. And often, a lot of the epiphanies I've had about what I actually seem to be doing with my work, it's often occurred during a lecture where I've sort of connected hitherto unconnected dots in my work as I'm speaking. It's sort of become quite a pleasurable thing to do, just to kind of have the chance to reflect a little bit and write something and to present works that often more ephemeral works that perhaps might not usually have as much attention as some of my bigger projects. And so that's indeed what I'm going to talk about tonight, some of my more ephemeral and, I hesitate to say experimental, but just some of my more gestural, informal pieces that I've worked on the last few years. I'll get into introducing those in a minute, but I thought I would just start by unpacking the 4 words in the title of my lecture, at the risk of patronizing all of you guys who are studying here, who are, I'm sure, are much better writers and wordsmiths than I am. But it's something that I find very useful in my practice anyway, is just I focus a lot on the semantics of language and of when I write and also when I design. And I'm really always interested in revisiting very familiar words just to remind myself as to what their true meaning and also the inevitable ambiguities that you find in commonplace words. And so if you just allow me to quickly unpack these. Theory, for example, I still use a paper dictionary. I don't know how many people still use books for their dictionaries, but this is my one going back to the RCA, actually. But theory, I mean, I decided I would look all of these up as I was preparing the talk, just to remind myself, just to make sure I really know what I'm talking about. Theory being a supposition or system of ideas explaining something. Another definition that I really like, which is it doesn't happen to exist exactly in those words, in the terms here in my paper dictionary, is theory being a set of principles on which practice is based. And that's kind of always been a real definition of theory that I've held to, just something quite unthreatening, the idea of just simply a set of principles that somehow inextricably ties theory to practice. You know, the idea of acting out certain ideas and thoughts. Practice, Alice did a fantastic job of articulating practice with an S. And I'll just kind of go through it a little bit. I don't have to say too much, but as Alice mentioned, practice with an S is I guess what we would both call the correct spelling of the verb practice. Americans don't differentiate between the verb practice and the noun practice. So the verb practice with an S has what I like to see as a built-in ambiguity, which I really loved and was the key reason why I chose it as the name of my studio when I graduated from the Royal College of Art in 1999. I like this idea of naming my studio with a verb. That was very important, but also the idea of this ambiguous verb that sounds very professional in its pronunciation. It sounds like an architectural practice, something that has ambitions of professional,ism perhaps, and the way I see it in terms of design, it's just a professional practice, a service even. I'm not worried about calling graphic design a service. I'm often happy to use it in that role. But I also like this hidden facet of the word practice, aside from the professional sounding noun, the verb being something much more amateur in a way, distinctly unprofessional. The idea of basically practice makes perfect, repeating a task and learning from it. That's the dictionary definition of practice, as we can see here, doing something repeatedly as an exercise in order to improve a skill. And that was basically my ambition when I started my studio, when I left the RCA. I loved the atmosphere that I had at the Royal College, experimenting, constantly learning and discovering new things. And the idea of becoming professional, the idea of being a professional once one leaves college, sounded terrible to me. And I kind of really like the idea of just constantly learning and using design. Graphic design in particular is ideally situated as a practice in which you can just continually learn new things. You constantly encounter new people in different fields. And this idea of just repeating an exercise and learning from it is something that I really value with my own practice, the noun practice. And then time and place is what we could really just read as context. And as you'll see in a lot of the projects I'm going to talk about this evening, history is really important to me in my work, and it's something I often reference and allude to and rely on with my work. And so there's kind of the historical element of context and time and place, but also the geographical, as Alice mentioned, all these different places where I grew up, and my constant sense of not belonging anywhere, and always weighing this in my mind as I'm working on particular projects, and how what I'm working on is tied to particular circumstances and particular distribution methods and how everything kind of circulates. And it's something I'm always thinking a lot about in my work, even in the most pragmatic projects, when it comes down to actual, just literal distribution of how to get work out there. So that pretty much sums all of that up. And I think the final word that's important is the word and. It's also worth unpacking. Because I think it's important to emphasize, when I'm talking about theory and practice and context, most of the projects I'm going to show this evening, probably all of them, usually involve all of the above. It's not sort of theory or practice or site-specific or not site-specific. It's usually a certain level of ambiguity that I like deliberately putting into my work, which I think you'll start seeing in some of these projects. And it's this word and. I think I'm very much against false dichotomies and black and white views of certain situations. I'm very much into gray areas. And so I think the word and is really important. And hopefully you'll see that this evening. I'm going to show you 6 projects from my studio. I must mention that Sian, who Alice mentioned, she's here with me in New York with my 2 daughters. I've got a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old daughter. We're here for spring break, and we've been walking the city for the last 3 days, and they were going to come tonight, and we're all just completely wiped out. I might fall asleep halfway through this, but they decided to just rest back at the hotel, and they kind of, they've heard me talk enough, as my 13-year-old reminded me before I left. But yeah, Sian's involved in a lot. You'll see some of her work in one of the projects I'll show this evening. But yeah, I'm going to show 6 projects. Without quite realizing it, 4 of the projects, as I look through them, 4 of them actually specifically deal with Chicago or are for Chicago. They're related to the kind of projects taking place in Chicago or very specifically dealing with Chicago. And then I'll finish with 2 projects at the end, 2 larger kind of identity projects, one of which is a fully fledged ongoing project that I have in progress right now with an art center at Harvard. And the other project is an identity project that questions the very need for identities in graphic design. So this is a good place to start. Chicago. This is a very well-known poster, famous poster in Chicago design history. Very simple statement. It's a true statement. They do have a great lake in Chicago. It's really nice. We go swimming every summer in the lake. And so that basically this project came in 2014. It was the AIGA Chicago invited 100 designers, 100 Chicago designers, to each make a visual response in poster form to the question, what does design in Chicago mean to you? And this was on the occasion of the AIGA Centennial, which took place in 2014, so that hence the 100 designers that they asked. And they displayed the resulting 100 posters by each of the designers at an event in June last year. And these are kind of always the types of projects that these are sort of projects that graphic designers often get, make a poster. And it's usually not really a poster, because a poster kind of actually really has to be distributed and be seen in the city, in my opinion. And these kind of projects, usually the poster is up in a gallery for one night and it's only seen by other graphic designers. But that kind of gave me a bit of license. I felt like, well, it doesn't have to, I'll embrace the fact that usually I love embracing constraints, but I embraced the fact that this really didn't have any constraints whatsoever for this poster. And it got me thinking, I thought I would just think about this literally. What does design actually mean to me in Chicago? I occupy a kind of outsider status a bit in Chicago. Me, Sian, and our girls, we live on the outskirts of Chicago in a real sort of John Hughesian suburb. We grow our own food in the backyard and live this kind of pseudo-hippie lifestyle in the suburbs. And we find it quite simultaneously scary and fascinating, but it's actually really nice. But I'm not really part of any kind of design scene, so it really got me thinking. But living in Chicago and moving to Chicago was really important for me, just from my prior knowledge. As a European, Chicago is kind of the crucible of modernism, and particularly the American kind of corporation-adopted slant of modernism. Mies and Moholy-Nagy and all the European emigres who went to Chicago, they still weigh quite heavily in the city, and you'll see this in a few of these projects. So this first poster really sprung to mind. John Massey, the Container Corporation of America, he was the Director of Design, Advertising, and Public Relations for the Container Corporation from 1964 to 1983. I actually saw a talk of John Massey's just last week in Chicago. It's quite incredible. He's still alive and practicing. He's the kind of guy who tells stories of, as a student, being sent to Aspen and being, as a kind of student helper, was asked to go and receive 2 visiting Swiss designers at the airport, Josef Müller-Brockmann and Armin Hoffmann. So he kind of, by accident, met these guys, and it sort of changed the course of his life. So you still have these very conscious, visible manifestations of this Swiss design history still present in people living in Chicago today. And the CCA story in itself is the kind of classic Chicago, for the public good, huge corporation that made these types of posters celebrating the city while also making a lot of money just as, basically a box company. They made cardboard boxes. And, but instead of making ads that showed pictures of their cardboard boxes, they would invite the likes of Herbert Bayer and Moholy-Nagy to make these beautiful advertisements that had nothing to do with cardboard boxes, but just elevated their company far above their fellow cardboard box manufacturers in the process. So this definitely stuck in my mind. Chicago has a great lake. Another work, as I decided to think I would try and gather together a group of Chicago works that somehow mean a lot to me in terms of design in Chicago. This is not necessarily a design work. This is an artwork, or rather a cartographic musical score by the American composer, music theorist, writer, and artist John Cage, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. And this is a beautiful work that's in the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago's collection called A Dip in the Lake. And this was just basically a map of Chicago from which one could derive a musical performance, where every single random point plotted on the map was an invitation for someone to make a sound recording or do some kind of performance in that location. And the collection of the resulting performances constituted the score. You could basically play the map in a way as a musical score. And I've always loved this, beautiful title, A Dip in the Lake, 10 quick steps, 62 waltzes, and 56 marches for Chicago and vicinity. Another work that you can't help think about when you think about design in Chicago is Mies van der Rohe's legendary SR Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology, which still today houses the architecture department of IIT. I've been in there quite a few times. I have had them as a client, design posters for them. And Crown Hall, I'm sure you're all familiar with this seminal modernist piece of architecture. It's one of the most architecturally significant buildings of the 20th century movement, and widely considered a great building. And the final work that I thought of, given Mies van der Rohe, was his other work, which took the great building and chucked it into the Great Lake. It's postmodernist architect Stanley Tigerman, and it's a work that he made in 1978, titled, a photo montage titled The Titanic. And Tigerman was one of the many architects you have in Chicago, schooled in the Miesian tradition, based much of his work in the 60s and 70s on the designs of Mies, and then gradually came to question the authority and durability of Mies's program, and through the 70s moved more into a boldly postmodernist kind of body of work for which he's now mostly known. And the idea of the Titanic was kind of a pictorial manifesto for Chicagoans, a call to arms to challenge the prevailing modernist orthodoxy that you still find today in the city. So my response to this simple question, what does design in Chicago mean to you, ended up being deceptively simple, which is, again, something I think you'll come across a lot tonight in my work. It's something that I kind of strive for in my work, to make work that is deceptively simple. It's sort of loaded and packed, but still, on the face of it, fairly simple. So what I did was, rather than really design a poster, it was more of just a kind of gesture almost, of just simply taking all of the preceding works you saw, which for me kind of culminated in this Titanic piece by Tigerman, and taking the Titanic and just throwing it back into the lake again. And so we had this ultimate collage of somehow combining everything. I decided to, the way I got John Cage in there was just in the title, a loop in the lake rather than a dip in the lake, with the definitely required subtitle of apologies to John, Stanley, and Mies. And the only addition really I made, apart from kind of clashing these two works together, was just the captions getting my apology out of the way and then just referencing John Cage, John Massey's Silkscreen, Tigerman's photo montage, and then, of course, Mies's glass and steel construction. So related to that, I'm just going to talk briefly about two different architectural theories which have gradually become quite important in my work. The first one particularly just since I arrived in Chicago, and it starts with a building that is just perpendicular to Crown Hall on the campus of IIT. Looks quite a lot like Crown Hall. It's got same kind of Miesian structure, corners. It even has these prominent steel girders on the top of the building. You know, on Crown Hall, you have these girders that famously hold up the building, allowing these beautiful spaces that you have inside. These particular girders, they're purely for decoration. They're not holding anything up. They're just kind of modernist decorative cherries on top of the Miesian pastiche sundae. And this is a work, one of the very first works by an architect, Chicago architect, who was at the time based at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, called Walter Netsch. And he's a particular architect that I've developed a bit of an obsession with in Chicago, mainly because very quickly after he sort of got his Miesian pastiche out of the way, as all Chicago architects seem to need to do, Netsch very quickly moved rapidly towards more of a brutalist aesthetic, which is a particular architectural movement that I personally love. So just to give you a brief summary before I go into his particular theory, which has been a great influence on me. This was fairly soon after that first building. He kind of moved away from the pastiche and just got into his own modernist groove. Still, for me, one of the most beautiful skyscrapers in the Loop in Chicago, the Inland Steel building. Just a beautiful work, kind of perfect solution to a client's problem. The Inland Steel building wanted a flagship building that advertised their presence in Chicago, so Netsch made the building of steel, of the steel from the Inland Steel company. And you have this beautiful steel building that still shimmers and looks almost brand new even today. He very quickly moved on to a kind of heavier, more socially informed, in terms of at least psychology and theoretically informed, brutalist aesthetic. This is the University of Illinois at Chicago's University Hall, which was designed along with the majority of the so-called Circle campus in downtown Chicago by Netsch. At this point, he was very much into this brutalist phase, heavy untreated concrete, narrow slots for the windows. This particular tower, which it's just outside the Loop, so you have the cluster with, this is not very far at all from Sears Tower, but just outside it really stands out just as this strange building where instead of setbacks, as the higher it actually gets wider. It's 20 feet wider at the top floor than it is at the base. It's a beautiful building. I always go on about how I love the UIC campus, especially when I meet people from UIC, and they always tell me how much they hate the campus because they live and work there. So it's one of those brutalist situations. The way I came to Walter Netsch in the first place, without digressing too much on Netsch, was through his libraries, not necessarily the IIT library I showed you, but the UIC library, this library at the University of Chicago campus, the Regenstein Library, which is beautiful. It's not concrete, it's sandstone, actually limestone. And this particular building is beautiful in terms of, again, being kind of almost like a too obvious solution to a library where the striated limestone resembles the foredges of books. When you look closely, it's actually quite, not iconic, but iconographic. I mean, it just does literally represent book foredges, as if the library's been kind of turned inside out. Really beautiful building. And the other library that actually the very first library I came across is in Evanston, near where we live in Chicago, at the Northwestern Library. And the Northwestern Library is one library in particular where anyone I talk to who studies or works there seems to really hate it. He kind of gradually evolved into this, what he called field theory, which, at least in terms of architectural presence, was made manifest in terms of these really kind of studying circulation of movement, and got to the point of like fractals, like just circulations within circulations, and quite crazy building types. But this field theory, as I started to read into it, I admired the buildings, understood that they were, in practice, very difficult to navigate. But field theory was something that Netsch took from Gestalt psychology. It's a psychological theory which examines patterns of interaction between the individual and the total field or environment. And I really started to see parallels with what I was trying to attempt to do with my own graphic design practice, and this notion of a dynamic field, as Netsch put it, the idea that behavior must be derived from a totality of coexisting facts. The coexisting facts make up a dynamic field, which means that the state of any part of a field depends on every other part of it. And so my own reading in terms of a graphic design context and application of field theory was, it resonated just being basically in terms of a good summary of the general approach that I try and take with my work. Research and analysis of each project's individual dynamic fields. I've started stealing that phrase. I really like that phrase. So basically the interdependent contents, contexts, and histories, which when combined with an open, collaborative, and respectful dialogue with the people you're working with your clients or with your collaborators, and a deep understanding of the content, will always lead to distinctive, relevant, unexpected, and what I like about it, actually often appropriately contradictory results. So the idea of this dynamic field informing the outcome of the project. Just before I get into a few more projects, I'll run through the other theory I'm interested in mentioning, which is one derived or coined by the American architectural theorist, landscape architect, and designer Charles Jenks, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. He's synonymous with his writings on postmodernism in architecture, and in particular, I found his notion of double coding, as he called it, really useful in considering some of my own approaches and ambitions for my graphic design practice. He coined this phrase in his 1977 book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, and he used it to suggest that postmodern architecture was a language that depended on double understanding, comparable to irony in a way. The idea that buildings have the capacity to convey many meanings simultaneously. He contended that through the use of color, ornamentation, and contrasting materials, postmodernism could be understood and enjoyed by the general public, yet at the same time command what Jenks called critical approval. So Jenks cited British architect James Stirling. James Stirling's another favorite architect of mine. He cited Stirling's Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart in Germany as a particularly good example of double coding, where an obviously modern building echoes and plays with past art and architecture, classical forms, pop art, color palette. And Jenks saw this kind of postmodernist building as a way of opening up the minimalist monocultural language of modernism to a wider history, wider context, and notions of difference. So that brings me on a very kind of sketchily tangential level to one of my projects from a couple of years ago in Chicago. It was actually a very small sort of ephemeral poster series. There was really no budget. It was printed on a risograph. And it was basically a series of 6 posters for a monthly film series on architecture and design, organized by Michael Graham, who's the director of a Chicago curatorial consultancy called Balloon, and Tim Parsons, who's the associate professor of designed objects at the School of the Art Institute, who I studied with at the RCA, and just out of pure coincidence, we both happened to move to Chicago in the very same week in 2010, each without the other knowing that we were moving. And also Casey Leary, an independent product designer. So these 3 kind of clubbed together. They wanted to put on a series of architecture and design film screenings. And the series was held at Black Cinema House, which in itself was a really interesting, powerful venue. It's one of several impressive Dorchester project cultural spaces that Chicago artist Theaster Gates is currently building as part of a major regeneration project on the south side of Chicago. Traditionally disadvantaged area of the south side, and I'm not sure how many of you know about Theaster Gates, but he's been sort of built this perfectly cyclical artistic practice where he's regenerating his area, and as he rebuilds each new building, he buys these buildings cheaply, regenerates them, and the kind of byproducts of wood and artifacts from those buildings become artworks, which he then sells, which in turn fund new buildings. And he's getting to the point now where he's bought some smaller buildings, he's now bought a huge dilapidated bank, which he's going to turn into a major cultural center. So just in itself, a really fascinating situation. But as far as it concerned our particular film series, it happened to be the venue where we showed these different films. So I'll just run you through some of these posters that I did. And these kind of it was these particular posters that got me thinking about maybe mentioning double coding as a way of, ideally with my work, and where I guess the service aspect or the sort of maybe professional aspect of design comes into it, is with any of my work, I'm very eager for the work to be as accessible as possible. I'm really interested in work not being dumbed down in any way, but more through a distinction that I often tried to make at the MCA when I was working there, this idea that I'm very much against populism, but I'm all for things being popular. So this was something that I'm always trying to do with all of my work, just try to, I think anything, no matter how complicated or deep or scholarly, always has the capacity to be popular if you communicate it in an enthusiastic and accessible way. And presenting things just with bright colors and interesting forms doesn't in any way deny the possibility for there to be further depth in the work. So this was at play in what I was trying to do with these posters. I mean, first in the season was a film of a series of design, critical design, speculative design, all of those kind of buzzwords. Designers working in that realm making films. So we had films by Dunn and Raby, by Alona Gaynor, Onkar Kular, and Noam Toran. And already I was kind of interested in establishing a certain style for the series, and I thought, well, I'd like to kind of always have three elements from the different films that we're showing. And often that was just literally going to be stills. That was the easiest way to approach it. But while having the stills, I also wanted to have different kind of conceptually charged shapes or contradictory shapes that would play with the stills in question. So for speculation, I decided to come up with what I called a bubble Bauhaus. So instead of the three familiar primary forms of the Bauhaus of triangle, circle, square, I came up with what I thought could be a speculative Bauhaus, which was balloon, thought cloud, and bubble, like an actual, this is like I don't know what you call these things, like a little bubble wand that you blow bubbles out of. I'm not very good at drawing, but that was, yeah, is it a wand? Yeah, so that was just me. I thought, well, I'll load the stills into these kind of conceptually charged forms, which is in a way poking fun at speculative design to a certain level, because, well, actually, I'll show you this other tangent, and you'll get what I mean. A year later, after doing this particular poster, just as an aside, I was invited to design a cover for an issue of Design Issues. And I did something that I often do, which is I'm not afraid of sometimes further evolving projects that I've worked on and taking various forms and then using them in new contexts. And so this particular issue, this is Design Issues, academic journal published by MIT Press, and every cover is designed by a different designer, each working within a two-color printing constraint. That's usually the only constraint. They let you do whatever you want. And this particular issue also featured speculative design or speculative thinking as a common theme in the various essays that they were publishing in this issue. They had essays on unknown positions of imagination in design, they had citizen science and open design, and they had an article about modeling business models. And so I thought this would be perfect, again, the bubble Bauhaus idea, where here, at least in this particular case, the speculation could be a financial, kind of economic speculation, in a sense. And but what I hid behind, and what I was sort of alluding to with the choice of bubbles originally in that previous poster, was what I hid on the back cover, which was the kind of ominous presence of the critic, ready to pop any of the bubbles. So just to continue with some of these other posters that I designed, this was, I contributed to the series by presenting an evening of Patrick Keeler's films. I don't know how many of you guys know Patrick Keeler. It's a British film essayist, part historian, part poet, part landscape photographer. Best known for the Robinson trilogy, which has been a hugely influential film series on my own work. It's kind of paralleled, he's made 3 films over the course of about 15 years, and it's kind of followed my own trajectory as a student. The first film in his trilogy, the so-called Robinson trilogy, is a film called London, which was released in '94, and then Robinson in Space in '97, which is when I graduated from actually when I started at the Royal College of Art, right when Tony Blair took power with New Labour in the UK. And then the final film, which only just came out very recently in 2010, Robinson in Ruins. And each of these films, Keeler presents a narrator who in voiceover describes the meandering of this character Robinson, an unseen scholar, government advisor, avid seeker of obscure places of historical, or as he puts it, sites of special scientific interest, places to haunt, as I quoted in the title, somewhere to haunt. I decided to present this series. In presenting the series, I showed just some excerpts from London and Robinson in Space, and I showed a full screening of Robinson in Ruins. And the latter film, Robinson in Ruins, I mean, all of these films, they kind of derive like situationist wanderings of, first one, London, and then Robinson in Space is the countryside in the rest of the UK. And then ultimately, Robinson in Ruins is kind of investigates what you could see as a strand through all three films, which is basically just the problem of England, as Robinson puts it. Britain's collusion with the United States military-industrial complex, capitalist interpretations of Darwinism with an economy that even increasingly today in the UK is dominated but just purely by finance and property rather than production. And all of which has led to the increasing enclosure of national assets and state activities by private entities. So the gradual takeover of the English countryside and the privatization of it. So that's what I was trying to attempt to just, pack into this poster in a very simple way as an introduction to Chicago audiences as to what Keeler was dealing with. So we kind of had this no entry sign for the privatization, which is taken from the official Her Majesty's Stationery Office Traffic Sign Regulations and General Directions Manual. A still from Robinson in Ruins there on the right, which shows an American military base, the security fence kind of cordoning it off in the English countryside. And the American security base is itself placed inside the profile of German writer and philosopher Johannes Wolfgang von Goethe, one of the many historical and literary figures frequently cited by Keeler in his films. Another recurring Keeler motif, which is one reason I really love his work, is this fantastic motorway sign. As a graphic designer, in the UK, we all love Jock Kinnear and Margaret Calvert, who designed the signage system in the 60s. And this is a classic one where there's a sign not only to the north and to Derby, but also to Toyota, just indicating the gradual privatization, the corporatization of the English countryside. But the Goethe reference, just in particular, without wanting to go on too much about Keeler, was classic Keeler motif here, which you'll see where an Oxford motorway sign is, through successive close-ups, reveals a patch of lichen growing on the lettering, which happens to resemble perfectly the profile of Goethe. Like all this kind of stuff just packed into these Keeler films under these ostensibly just serene, 5-minute long still shots of the countryside. So, I can't help but just throw that in there into the poster. So without digressing too much, just some of the other posters. There were some great, powerful films shown. This was a particular film about a documentary from 2012 called Herman's House, documenting Herman Wallace, a prisoner in the Louisiana state prison system, stuck in solitary confinement for over 40 years. And he was asked the powerful question of what kind of house a man living in a 6x9 foot box might dream of. What would his dream house be? So I kind of had his diagram of the dream house, his own self-drawn diagram of the solitary confinement that he lives in, and then his portrait kind of embedded in the shape of that solitary confinement cell, as you can see here. A few other series. There was a screening of Citizen Architect, really interesting documentary on Sam Mockbee, the artist and architect who founded the Auburn University Socially Conscious Design Build Architecture Program Rural Studio. A series of films on Martin van Severen, the famous and infamous Belgian furniture designer. We went all out and did use 3 colors on this one. And the final screening was Andrew Garrison's 2007 film Third Ward TX, which documented the historically African-American Houston inner city area of the Third Ward, where a public art program called Project Row Houses has used the tools of design and art and architecture to regenerate the area, building classrooms, education spaces, gardens. And here I borrowed Sam Durant made an installation on one of the shotgun houses there, which I then in turn kind of, all of his works appropriated from 60s and 70s protest signs. So I kind of appropriated his work again for the poster. Another Chicago project, this one very specifically dealing with Chicago and its history, was a collaboration between Sean and I, my partner. And it was a rare thing where it was a public competition run by the city of Chicago, and we're usually not really so interested in competitions. But this was for a really good course and a really good outcome. Basically, the result was anyone who designed out of the final selections, the posters were actually going to go up in the city on public city information and bus shelters and things like that. And it's always a thing, especially after having taught in Switzerland and places like that, where you still have a presence in the urban landscape of cultural or non-commercial posters. It always seems quite valuable to have the chance to place a poster in this kind of context where, in the UK and the US, it's really just the domain of beer and car ads and things like that. So that seemed worthwhile, the idea of doing a poster and not only get it out there in the city, but also in terms of promoting sustainable Chicago. There was this new initiative by the city, Sustainable Chicago 2015, where they wanted designers to bring the city's motto, which is Urbs in Horto, Latin for city in a garden. And they wanted to bring, designers to bring that to life in some way for public display. And so we kind of really started talking about this, and we were quite interested in the idea of a simple, accessible poster that didn't need to say too much, highlighting how the radical modernists rise from the ashes of the Great Fire in 1871 in Chicago, which led to all of the amazing advances in skyscraper and building technology, which everyone knows about Chicago. What is perhaps less known about Chicago is the equally forceful and influential city and citizen campaigns for the creation and protection of green spaces in the city. And you still have that today with these incredible parks. Figures like urban designer Daniel Burnham, landscape architect Jens Jensen, and particularly Frederick Law Olmsted, who all of you here in New York will know from Central Park and Prospect Park fame. So we really wanted to highlight, the idea of cities, not only the architectural city, but also the floral or the garden city. So this was me. I just cut out the skyline of Chicago. Sean does a lot of illustration work. We're starting a children's book publishing company, as Alice mentioned. One of our books is just going to be a book of flowers for children. And Sean's been illustrating these beautiful flowers. And so we decided, what would happen if we allowed the flowers to be the height of skyscrapers and really just combine them both. Just something very simple and quite innocent to put out in the city. But we really also wanted to think about a particular phrase or slogan. And this is where I was interested in bringing a little bit of ambiguity into the picture. And so we wanted something kind of uplifting, but also maybe a little bit challenging. And almost as a joke, I suggested, why don't we put, grow up Chicago, which you could read negatively, like, grow up, or sort of emphatically, like, let's all grow up, let's all plant gardens. And so we went with this, and surprisingly, it was actually really rather controversial with the city of Chicago. We were actually awarded the grand prize for the poster design, so that was great. It meant our poster was really going to go up around the city. But at the same time, the city of Chicago wanted us to change the wording, or at least they hinted to the jury, do you think they would change the wording? Luckily, there was one person who knew me on the jury who quite rightly said that I wouldn't be interested in changing any wording for the poster. So it stayed like that and went out in the city. And what was even better, it was great having this poster out in the city. That was a real pleasure and honor in a way, just to have a nice, simple poster in the city of Chicago. But what I loved in particular, I hadn't really thought about the ultimate context of where this poster was going to operate in the city. And first time I came across it on the corner of Randolph and State Street in Chicago, in the Loop, it was fantastic because, it had city information, grow up. I love that, city of Chicago, and not only grow up Chicago, but it was signed by Mayor Rahm Emanuel at the bottom there. So I just thought that was brilliant. It lights up at night, it was great. So we kept spotting our poster around the city. This was the less picturesque corner of Kedzie in California by the interstate, sort of in Logan Square in Chicago. So yeah, that was, just, I think always nice just to have something that's sort of for the civic good in some capacity. I mean, the particular typeface, relating back to what I was talking about with modernist presence in Chicago, for me, there's still this sort of Helvetica or standard is still like the legitimately civic typeface in Chicago. O'Hare's signage system is in Helvetica. The CTA, the public transport, the L is in Helvetica. Most parking buildings have, like, park in big Helvetica letters. So it's kind of this, I felt like to give this poster civic legitimacy, it needed to have Helvetica as well, just to kind of put it on that same kind of infrastructural level as car parks and the L. Another Chicago project, well, this is more widely like an Illinois project, and this came from just basically one of those reminders that you get every now and then as a foreigner living in the US that you really are living in the United States. And this was particularly on the occasion, July 9th, 2013, where Illinois, amazingly to me, I didn't even realize, but it was, I was worried about this gun law, but I realized that it was the last state in the United States to allow carrying firearms in public, with the passing of the 430 ILCS 66, the Firearm Concealed Carry Act in Illinois. And so the new law came into effect on January 5th, 2014, establishing the concealed carrying of firearms as the default status quo, basically. And under the law, there are more than 25 types of establishments where guns are banned, including schools, government buildings, airports, parks, bars, casinos, and zoos, and libraries. But what's interesting to me is any business or private property, excluding residences, that wish to prohibit firearms on their premises have to opt out. Like, the default is you are allowed to carry guns, and you have to opt out of it by, in the words of the Illinois State Police, clearly and conspicuously posting one of these signs. They're very helpful. They have a PDF to download off the Illinois State Police website, which is where I got this PDF. But the rule they have, I don't know how consistent this is across all the other states in the US or whether it's just Illinois, but basically you are asked to opt out by clearly and conspicuously posting a state police approved sign at what I would say is the distinctly unclear and inconspicuous size of 4 by 6 inches, which is kind of like, postcard or bumper sticker size. And so where this really hit me was the first day back after New Year, January last year. This is my daughter's elementary school, and it's kind of walking my daughter to school and then getting hit with the no gun sign on your daughter's school, which, I don't know, I think even in the US, a lot of us were kind of blown away by this. But from London, when you're from London, you kind of come here. I mean, we moved here from Arnhem, and when you have a reminder please leave your, I don't know what you're supposed to do. Like, where do you leave your gun before you walk into the school building? You just stick it in the bush or something. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, put it in the gun bucket. So that kind of really hit me, oh my God, this is in the wake of recent tragedies in Connecticut and things like that. It's one of those reminders, we live in the United States. It's really quite shocking. But then, visiting Crown Hall that I just showed you earlier, even there, you needed this kind of no guns, please reminder even on a National Historic Landmark like Mises Crown Hall. So it was something really heavily on my mind, just trying to process what does this mean. And just right at that particular time in January last year, I was invited to participate. It was obviously on a lot of other Chicagoans' minds too, and I was invited to participate in an art exhibition at the University of Chicago dealing with this very topic, with the Concealed Carry Act. And I kind of almost immediately knew what I needed to do. And what I decided to do was just take that download, the PDF download, and I started thinking, what can I do? I felt like I needed to protest or at least kind of articulate my thinking. I didn't quite know how I was computing this whole idea of what concealed carry meant. I still don't fully know what it means. Is it better to, hide your gun on you, or is it better just to at least know when someone's packing heat and you can kind of see them walking around with their gun? I still don't really know. But I thought, well, what I thought could be interesting was just to try and make a form of protest just with the simplest of gestures, and still remain within the Illinois State Police's 4 by 6 guidelines. And so my response was basically repetition. So to take the 4 by 6 tile and simply tile it like bricks. And this is just an Illustrator swatch. So it's a swatch you can give to anyone. They can load it into their swatches palette in Illustrator, and you can immediately fill anything you like with the state-approved 4 by 6. The nice thing was that the State Police rules don't dictate, they dictate 4 by 6, but they don't dictate how many 4 by 6 signs you can place. So you can kind of, another aside, something I could go into for a whole hour is just patterns as another kind of graphic form that I love. The idea of designing something small and finite in terms of its tile, but then having the infinite capacity for repetition, to any scale. I mean, here repetition becomes sort of repetition ad nauseum, to the point of being sick of seeing so many guns potentially. But I was interested in the idea of what does repetition mean? Does it mean sort of emphasizing? Does it mean it's pro-gun or anti-gun control? It's sort of, again, had these layers of ambiguity. And so for the exhibition, I simply, the gallery is kind of further into the building. So I just asked for the entrance because I felt like, well, I have to display this at the entrance because that's where the state police tells you have to display the sign. But it just became this info repeat. I just reso printed a little tile, and I spent a day just tiling the entire wall of the entrance just so you were confronted with hundreds and thousands of guns as you walked in. All right, I think, how am I doing for time? So I'll finish up with two projects. Just as an interlude, I'll just go into just identity in general. I mean, Alice spoke about it even better than I could, just this idea of my background and sense of place being something quite important to me in terms of just something I always think about because, in general, because I've lived in so many different countries, I was born in Australia to Australian parents. We left, my father worked for a Swedish multinational, so at the age of 10, we moved from Perth in Western Australia to Stockholm, ostensibly for 2 years, and then we were going to move back. A lot of people in the company would do a kind of tour of duty in their head office in Stockholm. But we never went back to Australia. I've never lived in Australia since I was 10. I still have an Australian passport as well as now a British passport. But we moved to Sweden and then to Denmark and then to Wales and then to Germany. I ended up moving back to London and stayed in London to study. With my two sisters and I, we were sick of moving when we were little, so we vowed to never move again when we grew up. We were going to we envied our friends who had lived in the same place their entire life and knew everyone. And of course, now I've ended up doing the very thing that I was criticizing my parents about to my own daughters. My wife is kind of similar background. She is Hong Kong Chinese, half Hong Kong Chinese, half New Zealander. So Sian grew up in Hong Kong and then moved to New Zealand. And now we've lived in London. We moved to Arnhem for a year before we were unexpectedly invited by the MCA to move to Chicago. And then a lot of our discussion now in Chicago is where we're going to move to next. So we kind of can't really help ourselves. So this was a college project where I was just trying to grapple with this idea. I graduated from the RCA in 1999. So at the time, a lot of my reading for my thesis, this was the moment in which airports was a big kind of critical theory phenomenon at the time. There was an exhibition at the Photographers Gallery. Fischli Weiss's airport series was fairly prominent. Marc Auger wrote his Non-Places book, which for me was like perfect. That was like, this is me, this is where I live in, I'm kind of a non-place resident. And so coming out of that, I made quite a few projects at the RCA about these questions. And this was something that, again, I use the word gesture a lot in my work, and it's something that I really value, the idea that graphic design has the capacity to allow for just simple gestures that don't need any kind of ultimate traditional application with which one might traditionally deem, making a piece actually graphic design. I mean, there was discussion I often had even at college with various tutors who would say, well, it's not graphic design unless it has a client, or it's not graphic design unless it's one of these officially accepted formats, a poster, a book, that kind of thing. Whereas this project was still to this day, it's not something I've ever really applied. It's just a gesture. It's almost become a ritual. To do with passport photos. Passport photos was something I was having to take a lot when I lived in London anyway, before I had a British passport. At that time in the 90s, even when I went to Paris, I would have to go to the French embassy to get a Schengen visa because Australia and France had this kind of diplomatic tit for tat where they each would force the other to have a particular kind of visa which would require you spending money and standing in an office for half a day. So I was doing lots of passport photos, and I gradually, at the time, print club stickers, these Japanese kind of multi-sheet photo stickers, were popping up around the UK, around London at least. And I found this kind of color, it's not really a color chart, it's just like a board from a board game. I don't even know what board game it is. It actually says Lucky Dip in the middle, which was something really nice as well. It kind of felt like a lucky dip where in terms of the random nature in which my family had moved around. And I started just using it as a color test. I would put it in front of my face and take photos. And at the time, it was purely formal. It was just an exercise to almost check the color reproduction of various photo booths. And it's one of these projects which I guess like the way I used the bubble Bauhaus motifs in a few projects, and they each attained their own meaning. This is something that, again, it's a piece of work of mine, or a body of work. I consider it a kind of body of work that sort of shifted in its meanings and attained new meaning to me as political and social circumstances have changed, as I've grown up, as I've gotten older, to the point where, you could say, on one level, it represents my lack of place. The passport photo is one of the most legitimate representations, our proofs of existence, the passport photo. So the idea of blocking your face in the passport photo seems quite subversive in a way, especially post 9/11, where, one's identity and one's passport and security cards became even more important. The idea of obscuring your face took on different, more ominous meanings. And so it's just this work that over years has kind of still something I do now and then when I remember to bring. I've still got the board on my bookshelf, and if I'm going on a trip, I'll take it with me if it's a place that I haven't had a photograph taken. And it's just increasingly more difficult to find photo booths at this point in time. I mean, especially in the US, like in the Netherlands, you can go to any train station, you can find a passport photo. The most recent one that I took for a lecture I gave about identity at the Graham Foundation in Chicago, I had to scour the city. Couldn't find them at train stations, and I realized that the place you go to, at least in Chicago, for passport photo booths is bars. Lots of bars, and have passport photos. And funnily enough, because they're kind of hipster bars that have passport photos, there are no color passport photo booths. They're all black and white. So I had to get a color photo test. So the most recent passport color photo test of mine is this old-looking black and white photograph, which has always been a funny thing. I mean, this, as another kind of useful element, this particular photo series has always been handy whenever I'm featured in a publication or in a magazine, or speaking at a conference, and they always ask for a photo. And as a designer, you're always expected to have the moody black and white photo of you kind of with your hand on your chin, looking over there. And I always just send them my passport photo, and they're always, because graphic designers love showing themselves black and white, my colors are always reduced to black and white with my silly color passport photo test. So this was, forced on me ironically at the Rainbow Club, a bar in Chicago. So I'll quickly rip through the final couple of identity projects so we can actually start talking all together. I wanted to show a more fully fledged, larger, ongoing project that I'm working on, just to show that I am a graphic designer too. And I've been very fortunate just in the last year to be invited by the new director, James Voorhees, the new director of the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard University. It's housed in this fantastic Le Corbusier-designed building, the only Corbusier-designed built work in the United States. You don't really count the UN, I guess, because it's sort of that's their claim anyway. So very fortunate to basically be awarded the project to do a complete new identity for the CCVA, as it's called. And it's actually very small. It's in this beautiful building which houses not only the CCVA, which is sort of more a curatorial program than an actual premises. It's a curatorial program that sort of operates throughout the building. It also houses, the building also houses the Visual Environmental Studies program of Harvard, the art program at Harvard, VES. And in the basement, it houses the Harvard Film Archive. And so you can see these beautiful old 35mm prints in a Corbusier-designed cinema. I highly recommend visiting. It's this great building with this ramp running through it. And it's just a perfect location. It's kind of dramatically dropped, controversially in the 60s, dropped into this, right in the middle of 19th century red brick Harvard, kind of sandwiched between the Harvard Faculty Club and the Bush Reisinger Museum, which has now just been redone by Renzo Piano. And it has this kind of ramp that runs all the way through, so you can basically walk from Quincy Street up through the ramp, up through the building, and where you can see all the artist studios, and then back down the other side to Prescott Street. And basically, Corbusier always had a thing against the US because he was never given a great commission. He always expected a great commission in the United States. And it was only right at the end of his life he finally got this Harvard commission. And so I think as a result, he was aware he was in ill health. He never actually lived to see the final building completed. So he seemed to really want to pack all of his 5 points of a new architecture into this one building. So it became like this US architectural primer for Corbusier's work. So in the building you have, pilotis, replacement of supporting walls with these slender concrete columns. You have roof gardens in various stages around the building. You have the free design of the ground plan, so there's absence of supporting walls and a kind of unrestrained internal usage of the building. This is what's now the cinema, the theatre. The free design of the facade, so a kind of separation of the exterior of the building from its structural function. So you have this free facade through which you can walk with this fantastic ramp. And you have the fifth point of Corbusier's is the horizontal window, so this kind of facade that's cut through its entire length to allow the rooms to be equally lit. And so this was a great project to work on. I mean, one of these projects as a graphic designer where it's often an approach that I take with identities is to kind of do the least amount possible as a graphic designer, just to kind of take all of the given circumstantial components and somehow organize them in a logical way and then just kind of step back from it and just let it do its thing. And so I kind of did that to varying degrees here on some very literal levels. I mean, already, first time I walked into the building for my first meeting, that you have this beautiful original signage, which happened to match almost perfectly the newly released Druk typeface from Commercial Type by Burton Hasibi. So that was kind of already this was my first little sketch just to mimic the signage on the building, and that kind of was good enough in a way. So, I just set it as CCVA as this kind of abbreviation, and that took care of one aspect of the identity. Another pleasure with any project that I'm fortunate enough to get involved with is raiding the archives, doing a heavy amount of research. And this was just, again, a pleasure. It's still rather an informal program to the point where they just have their archives. I imagine it's Harvard and it's an art center and they have archives, so I'm going to go into some climate-controlled room, and it's basically just boxes in their office that you're able to sift through. And so it's incredible. I was lucky, my first visit, to spend 2 days just looking through the archives, paralleled an artist visit by Martin Beck, who artist I'm a big fan of, who also explores modernist ideologies in his work to a certain level. And so Martin and I were just together sifting through the archives to do 2 days, every 5 minutes, saying, oh my God, look at this, and pulling out, a letter from Paul Rand informing the then director that no, he wasn't interested in attending a typography symposium at the Carpenter Center because any gathering of typographers is unlikely to solve any problems. There was also another fantastic letter from Herbert Bayer declining a visit, saying he was unable to attend, but they might want to get in touch with a young designer who's just started at the Container Corporation by the name of John Massey. So incredible, opportunity. All the correspondence, and I'm still a graphic designer, so I love Olivetti typewriter and condensed and extended grotesque typography. And so that really, for me, in a way, informed the identity without wanting to be a pastiche going back to the 60s, but just to somehow allow the identity to feel appropriate in some way. And so ultimately, it's all in progress. These are renderings, just various manifestations, mixtures of the condensed, the extended, and Josef Müller-Brockmann designed typewriter typeface and signage and so on. And so where I started to play around with these elements, even though they're very simple and almost kind of as found, sort of just simply ready-made kind of contextual type and design elements, was with the website, which is still in progress. It's online, you can see it. It's not responsive yet. We're working with the Harvard web publishing team to remedy that. But at least what I was trying to do with Jim, the new director, is really transforming the whole program. It's very energetic, very ambitious. They're constantly having new speakers and artists in residence and programs that seems to far extend beyond their meager budget that they have. And I wanted to reflect this somehow on the website. So the website, with my obsession of the building and the principles that Corbusier had imbued, was really just to make the homepage this kind of, I'll just see if I can repeat that again, just to kind of make an elevation of the whole building. So you have sort of the film archive is in the basement, and then you have VES as kind of the middle levels, and then the Carpenter Center is both at the top and at the bottom. So it was just a subconscious thing. People visiting the website would somehow feel familiar when they arrive at the building without it being overtly described as such. And otherwise, it's just very simple geometries, borrowed circles and squares from Corbusier's plans to represent the various programs that are going on. So it's all in progress at the moment, but starting to gradually play around with these various simple modular elements and doing a little publication series for each exhibition, and so on. So I'll finish up. I hope I've got time. What I'm going to do, how have we got? We've got like 5 minutes? All right, I'm going to do this really quickly. Yeah. So good to finish up with confusion. This was a project made for an exhibition. It's an identity project made for an exhibition called White Noise at the 2012 Chaumont International Poster and Graphic Design Festival in Chaumont in France. And I was invited by curators Sophie Demey and Etienne Hervy, who had curated this show called White Noise, dealing with music and graphic design. And the rest of the exhibition had, fantastic retrospective of British graphic designer Barney Bubbles, who a lot of people still today don't know about, but he's an incredible graphic designer, along with work by French illustrator Mehdi Herkberg, Laurent Fetti, Amsterdam Studios, Monica, and Experimental Jet Set, all kind of showing their work that relates to music. And I was invited to collaborate with the curators to make this, what they called an identity project for it's sort of a fictitious, more, I guess, speculative record label. The idea for which was a label that could not only release music, but would also operate as a platform for art, design, and even more ephemeral things like exhibitions, events, or even just ideas. Anything could be a valid release from this so-called label. And so I was kind of tasked with that. We kind of collectively formulated the idea of, let's call it confusion. You'll hear why in a minute. Lots of references that we all kind of packed together. But they were really busy setting up the rest of the exhibition. So they kind of said, okay, we've come up with this general idea. We've got an approach and some principles. It should be open to anyone. Anyone can submit anything, and it could be a release. You go ahead and design the identity. So I kind of had this 2 weeks before Chaumont to somehow work on an identity with no content. I mean, there was nothing. We didn't actually have any releases at the time, but there was a space marked aside at the exhibition in this warehouse for me to do work. And I spent most of, I think, a week and a half of the 2 weeks just grappling with what am I going to do? Like, how can I do an identity? Does a record label even need an identity? What kind of self-respecting record label would have having an identity means you have to have an identity manual, and who's going to tell graphic designers what to do? I mean, that's not very cool. And so I really was grappling with all these issues and thinking even further about the gradual devolution of music and record labels in the past 20 and 30 years, from vinyl to CD to mini disc to MP3, the shrinking down of artwork to the current sort of inevitable non-artwork that you have in iTunes of just a gray musical note. And so I really started exploring more of these issues of the demise of sleeve notes and other kind of traditional design manifestations of music, the dematerialization of graphic form, and even the tyranny of identity in the graphic design realm. Something that even now I'm working on the identity for the Carpenter Center and aware that I'm going to have to write some kind of semblance of guidelines to hand over to someone to continue with it. And it's something I always struggle with because I'm the last person who wants a graphic designer handing me a rule book. And I hate the idea of handing someone else a rule book just to stifle their creativity. So in grappling with all these things, I thought, well, okay, I've got no content. Why don't I just create the content as the first releases, where I can kind of deal with some of these issues? And so that's what I did. And we kind of found particular influence in the spirit of a label like Tony Wilson's late 70s, early 80s Factory Records, where for them, aside from records beautifully packaged by Peter Saville and related ephemera, I mean, they would release records, of course, but they would release promotional graphics. Sometimes they would release a film with the FAC kind of catalog number. But they also, something I've always loved about Factory's history is that some of their releases, when you look through their discography, include such disparate phenomena as a lawsuit, which is a FAC 61 catalog number, a party, FAC 83, the infamous nightclub, the Hacienda, is cataloged FAC 51, and even the Hacienda's resident cat was known as FAC 191. And so, think about all these things, we sort of ended up with this. Let's see where we are here. This was the installation in the end. And I'll just run you through. I kind of made, I think, 5 tangible artifacts that were the first releases. I also threw in some of my kind of thinking aloud, the idea of this kind of dematerialized music. So I had the default iTunes note hung up high because it's kind of in the cloud. And so for me, ultimately, when I actually had to come up with something visibly, tangibly designed for the exhibition to fill the space, if nothing else, the first thing I thought of was, okay, we're going to have to catalog every release. So the first release could be the catalog stamp itself that is used to catalog other releases. So CNF001 is the Confusion catalog stamp. CNF002, I kind of went ahead with it despite my reservation, said, well, okay, I'll make an identity manual. And that took the form of a 20-track album, which I'll play for you in a minute if you will humor me in listening to that. CNF003 was the whole white noise exhibition. CNF004 was the Confusion installation within the white noise exhibition. And I felt like, it's a record label, we need some merch. So we made a slip mat, CNF005, and the graphic on the slip mat was just the catalog stamp of 005. And then just because I was lamenting the demise of sleeve notes, something I've always loved, and just really thinking a lot about the dematerialization of music as a commodity, I wrote some sleeve notes, which I'll now, I think, read. I'll read you the sleeve notes, and then I'm going to play you the manual, and then that'll be it. I'll stop talking. So you'll probably recognize where this is coming from. This is the infamous or famous Hypnosis-designed cover of Go To, a record by XTC from the late 70s. Which was, I don't know how many of you guys know this record cover. It's a fantastic self-referential essay about how design and copywriting, right at this moment as you're holding the record cover, is attempting to seduce you into buying the record. And it's something I've always loved, so I decided to riff on that particular cover and wrote these sleeve notes to accompany the manual, which itself doesn't have a cover, so I decided to make an empty vinyl cover with sleeve notes on it. And so I'll just read this out to you. This is Confusion. More precisely, these are the sleeve notes for Confusion Manual, the second release from the label Confusion, catalog number CNF002. Confusion Manual is what it says it is, a manual describing the label Confusion and how to use it. The first Confusion release is the catalog number stamp, or logo, itself. The word Confusion repeated twice in a circle with the catalog number set in the middle, 001. This design you are reading right now is not to be confused with the album cover. Confusion Manual's album cover consists of the aforementioned circular catalog stamp and it can be seen on the screen of any digital device that happens to be playing it. The sleeve note is a lost art. Sleeve, album, or liner notes, as they're also known, traditionally accompany a record or compact disc with a mix of factual and anecdotal material relating to the recording. In the best instances, they provide a forum for thoughtful signed essays on a given artist by respected music critics or writers. There is still a Grammy Award category for best album notes. As the format in which Confusion Manual is distributed confirms, the contemporary sound recording is now largely a dematerialized artifact, an intangible digital file stored in the cloud, often without cover art, let alone sleeve notes. At worst, digital albums are given a default grey musical note in lieu of an actual cover. Sleeve notes are a distant memory, a ghost now replaced by Wikipedia, weblogs, and social media buzz. While Confusion Manual is itself text which just happens to be read aloud and arranged in the format of a 20-track album, we felt it was important to revive the late lamented sleeve note as an additional layer of reading material for the listener to read while listening to text read aloud, which is why you are here reading these sleeve notes. Confusion Manual is a kind of identity manual for a label that questions the need for identity manuals. Its serious manifesto-like format belies references to the read-along storybook/tour guide motif found on such seminal early 90s hip-hop albums as De La Soul is Dead and A Tribe Called Quest's Midnight Marauders. Speaking of references, the very design of these sleeve notes might remind you of the famous Hypnosis artwork for XTC's 1978 album Go To, but be assured it is not a rip-off or even a homage. Think of it more as a cover version. All right, so if I may, I'm going to play you the admittedly dry but hopefully increasingly funny Confusion Manual. So if I just exit this, jump over to iTunes, and there we go. Oh yeah. 1 second while I plug myself in. All right, here we go. So I wrote this manual for any designer coming into contact and collaborating with or participating in any Confusion Label project. And it's narrated in English by the curator Dieter Rulstrater and in French by the designer Carole Courtier. And I'll cut most of the French just to enable us to finish up.
Confusion Manual CNF 002.
Confusion Manuel CNF 002.
Track 1. This is confusion.
Piste 1. Ceci est confusion.
This is confusion. Confusion is a collective project by Sophie Demet, Etienne Hervey, with James Goggin.
Ceci est confusion. Confusion est un projet collectif par Sophie Demet et Etienne Hervey avec James Goggin.
Track 2. Label.
Piste 2. Label.
More precisely, confusion is a label. A label is an organization that coordinates production, manufacture, distribution, and promotion of music. Confusion proposes the addition of design, arts, and culture to music as valid forms of output. Track 3. Catalog number.
Piste 3. Numéro de catalogue.
Every release from the Confusion label is assigned a catalog number. Track 4. Release.
Piste 4. Sortie.
A release is not necessarily a sound recording. An event, exhibition, work, or even an idea may also be classified as a release. Track 5. Logo.
Piste 5. Logo.
For example, the Confusion catalog number stamp, which one might also consider a logo, is the first release from Confusion. While the stamp is designed to be used as a catalog numbering system, it is also a cataloged release itself and is therefore assigned the catalog number CNF 001. Track 6. Circle.
Piste 6. Cercle.
Confusion is a circle.
Confusion est un cercle.
Track 7. Like a record.
Piste 7. Comme un disque.
The Confusion catalog stamp is typeset in the typeface Helvetica textbook. The word confusion is repeated twice in a circle, with a catalog number set in the middle. When placed on a white background, the stamp is black. When placed on a black background, the stamp is white. When displayed online, the stamp is an animated GIF on infinite loop, spinning round, right round like a record. Baby. Track 8. CNF 002.
Piste 8. CNF 002.
You are currently listening to Confusion Manual, which is catalog number CNF 002. Confusion Manual is a recording which introduces confusion and explains how it works. Track 9. Playback.
Piste 9. Lecture.
The first public playback of this recording, Confusion Manual, will take place in CNF 004, an installation also titled Confusion Manual. The installation itself is part of the exhibition White Noise, curated by Sophie Demet and Etienne Hervey in partnership with Confusion and catalogued CNF 003. Featured in the installation is the first piece of merchandise released by the label, a Confusion turntable slip mat set to spin round, right round like a record. Track 10. Invitation.
Piste 10. Invitation.
If you are listening to this recording, it is possible that you have been invited to work with the Confusion label on a project. As you will understand from the aforementioned descriptions, you will need a copy of the Confusion stamp in order to properly catalog your project. Track 11. Black and white.
Piste 11. Noir et blanc.
In the production, manufacture, distribution, and documentation of a Confusion project, you are strongly encouraged to use the colors black and white. Confusion also urges you to use the utilitarian yet slightly mannered typeface Helvetica textbook for all typesetting. Track 12. Confusion Manual.
Piste 12. Le manuel de confusion.
In thinking about the record label model, the notion of label identity and the role of identity manuals in the field of graphic design Confusion asked itself, what kind of self-respecting music label would have an identity manual telling graphic designers what they can and cannot do?
On réfléchit.
Track 13. What is confusion?
Piste 13. Qu'est donc confusion?
As you work with confusion on your project, it is important to understand what confusion is and what confusion is not. Track 14. Vessel.
Piste 14. Le navire.
Think of confusion as a vessel to contain projects that might happen in the future. Track 15. Ghost.
Piste 15. Fantôme.
Think of confusion as a ghost to evoke projects that might have happened in the past. Track 16. Labels.
Piste 16. Label.
While confusion is described as a label and looks like a label, it isn't necessarily a label. Track 17. Dematerialized.
Piste 17. Dématérialisé.
Confusion deals with the idea of music, design, arts and culture, and their production. Many projects, such as concerts or exhibitions, are temporal and ephemeral. Some projects, like sound recordings, are dematerialized, living only in the cloud. Some projects will rely on printed matter for promotion. Others may rely on printed matter for documentation. Still others may not rely on printed matter at all. Track 18. New Order.
Piste 18. New Order.
You might think that the name Confusion is a reference to Confusion, a single released by the British group New Order in 1983 on Factory Records with the catalog number FAC 93. But it is in fact a reference to Confusion is Sex, the first studio album released by the American group Sonic Youth in 1983 on Neutral with the catalog number 009. Track 19. Sonic Youth.
Piste 19. Sonic Youth.
You might think that the name Confusion is a reference to Confusion is Sex, the first studio album released by the American group Sonic Youth in 1983 on Neutral with the catalog number 009. But it is in fact a reference to Confusion, a single released by the British group New Order in 1983 on Factory Records with the catalog number FAC 93. Track 20. Genesis.
Piste 20. Genesis.
You might think that the name Confusion is a reference to Land of Confusion, a single released by the British group Genesis in 1986 on Virgin Records with the catalog number Gen S3, but you'd be wrong.
Thank you.
I think we can safely say that's the first time Land of Confusion has been referenced in one of our lectures, so thank you for that. Come take a seat, we're going to have a chat. We'll have to make it slightly concise because we have a bar to get to. That was really wonderful, thank you so much. I actually have a rejection letter to trump yours. A modernist hero rejection letter to add to yours. I found a telegram from Charles Eames rejecting an invitation to the Aspen Design Conference saying, sorry, can't come, too much nature, stop, too many designers, stop. That was pretty great.
That's true.
Anyway, to business. Well, first of all, did you have an epiphany during the lecture?
Yes. I probably shouldn't play that manual at the end of every lecture.
Well, hopefully you'll make it. It was great. I wanted to ask you about your practice as a writer and a designer and your interest in language. Do words look different to you when you're designing with them or when you're writing with them? And if so, how?
That's a good question. I guess I probably do. I never thought about that, actually. Well, the first thing is I don't really consider myself a writer necessarily. Well, I don't dare call myself a writer because I... Oh, do I?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a bit pretentious, isn't it? But I hesitate. I find writing very useful. I find it very difficult to write, and I'm constantly living in fear of, I think, like Stuart's in the audience, he can attest to, early on I would promise things, I would try to write things for ... and then never submit them in the end because I didn't quite dare, I didn't think they were good enough. I mean, I think the thing is when I'm both writing, actually, one realization which I gradually came to accept as a pleasurable thing is the fact that when I'm trying to write is the time when I find myself reading the most. And I'm sure that's true for everyone who writes. And it's the same thing when I'm designing. Is mostly when I'm designing, I'm reading, because most of the time I'm fortunate enough to be designing things that are well written and are interesting, and I find myself just reading whole chapters before I realize I'm supposed to be typesetting them. And even though I've read them already, I try to read everything before I design them. So I guess on one level, it all involves reading. Whether I'm trying to write myself and struggling, or whether I'm typesetting, which in itself is something I find very therapeutic. Just the typesetting. I've just typeset a big biography of Ettore Sottsass, and just the several nights of just typesetting the entire book, getting the justification correct, is extremely mundane yet therapeutic.
Form of reading. Yeah. And talking of reading, I really enjoyed all of the just those layers upon layers, especially in that the film series posters you were showing us of just this kind of excavation of history that's going on. Do you have any evidence that any people who come into contact with those pieces of graphic design actually do that kind of reading of them? And does it matter?
No. First answer is no. I have no evidence. I should try and get more empirical evidence. I would enjoy that. I mean, I know that people like the posters. They've told me they like them, and they've nicked them from cafe windows in Chicago. So on a certain level, I think they mean something. I'm always very meticulous with these things. I love captioning. I mean, I'm very pleased you guys are doing something on footnotes, because I love footnotes. Mm-hmm. But I love just captions. I guess just having typeset so many art catalogs that you have to enjoy captions. But so I'm always meticulous about captioning, the provenance of everything that I'm using. Yeah. And so for me, that's one easy way in a way.
So they can follow.
So they can see if their interest is piqued by how something looks, they can see who made it and what year it was from. So that's always really important, and I hope one way in. But I'm also equally happy for someone to see the poster and enjoy it and not be interested in delving any deeper. And I think that's the role the poster has to have too, is just to exist purely on a formal level and to provide a service of telling someone what time the film was on. And a good friend of mine, John Hares from London, who now practices in Lausanne, had this great thing that he once said to me, basically, as a graphic designer, he's a real, I had to write about him once for a book, and I resisted calling him a minimalist, but I called him a deadpan graphic designer, where to the point where he describes, graphic designers basically just need to get the time and date right. Anything beyond that is showing off.
That's certainly one way of looking at it. So through all this work on, I thought it was just really interesting the way you're talking about identity projects and then the anti-identity project and your own explorations of your personal identity. I just wondered at this point in your life after these multiple moves, have you reached any new insights or a level of peace with yourself at this kind of roving sort of condition that we both find ourselves in, but you're way more extreme?
Well, there's I mean, it's always disconcerting. I still feel like I really don't belong anywhere. And my wife and I are always having conversations about where we're going to move. We have my parents, they're from Australia, but they've actually retired in New Zealand, and Sian's parents are also, her father was a New Zealander, so we've ended up with a lot of relatives in New Zealand. I mean, I guess one realization is just that I'm, in spite of any kind of identity crisis that on a very minor level that I might have, we realize that we're in a very fortunate position to be able to talk about maybe moving back to Amsterdam or to Europe or moving to New Zealand, and it's sort of a very fortunate position to be in. It's something that I addressed a little bit in my thesis at the RCA, where I was dealing with notions of migration, and I very quickly went from my own background of, I've moved around a lot, which is sort of increasingly not such an interesting or rare thing. I mean, everyone moves, but more about, the people who are forced to move and how they deal with that, forced, refugee status rather than migration. And so I guess on one level, just on a deeper level, it's like just being very lucky to be able to have this first world problem of where to move to. But yeah, I do confess we still, we live on the outskirts of Chicago, and it's very common that Sian and I find ourselves at a strip mall in Skokie, Illinois, asking us how the hell we ended up here.
Whilst checking your gun at
checking the gun at the door, but whilst also photographing a really interesting sign that I just saw, because it's kind of fascinating, the whole landscape there.
Hey, by the way, you totally dodged the contemporary art museum of Chicago situation.
Yes.
Chicago, I can't even say it.
MCA.
Your identity work did not do a very good job. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what worked
Yeah.
and ultimately what didn't there?
Well, I think it was an extremely valuable experience. It was sort of a crazy move on one level. I mean, leaving the RCA, I'd always vowed to never get a job. Like I didn't want to. I was offered a few jobs at studios in London, and I stubbornly said no. I wanted to start my own thing, and of course, then proceeded to spend 3 or 4 years making tons of mistakes while friends of mine worked at a really good studio for 2 years, then started up their own really professional studio, knowing exactly how to do everything. So there was kind of a bit of stubbornness to it. But yeah, we had just moved to the Werkplatz in Arnhem, my whole family from London. That was a big move to finally leave London. And just within, I think, a year to the day, we found ourselves packing up and driving to Schiphol to fly to Chicago, having first said no to a position at the MCA and then found it so compelling, this idea of a kind of effectively a blank slate at a major contemporary art museum with a fantastic collection, incredible history, great curators, and just this blank slate for publishing as well as design. I mean, just to have the publishing aspect too was something I just felt like I couldn't turn down. An area that I found myself by default in London falling into just because certain galleries I would work with wouldn't have editors working on the project or would have a distributor who I knew wouldn't be interested in, getting a tiny little pamphlet publication around all the bookshops, so I would kind of advise them how to distribute it outside of that. So that was great, and I was very lucky to build a really good team of editors. We had one long-suffering, really overworked editor when I started there, and we hired 2 more editors. We had 2 fantastic designers, website designer, video producer, new media manager. So we kind of gradually built this great team and just worked ourselves to the bone for 3 years, I think they were doing 1 publication a year at the time, and we went up to about almost 5, I think, a year. The curators were equally eager to publish, so that was kind of a good and a bad thing. We were sort of our own worst enemies, being enthusiastic. Anytime the possibility of a book was raised, we said, yes, let's do one. And in the meantime, I was managing a department. I was a senior manager, so I had to go to senior management meetings, which, again, for me was something I was sort of an incredibly time-consuming and boring thing, but something that I really valued because one of my main clients in London was the Tate, and I was always fighting to get into certain meetings as an outside, as a commissioned designer. There are always meetings that are relevant to the designer and meetings that are not relevant, and usually the irrelevant meetings are the really good meetings. Yeah, the ones you should be out talking to the artist or to the curator. And at the Tate, you would usually get asked, your meeting would be scheduled with the marketing department, who were great, but it wasn't the full picture, only talking to marketing. So that was getting into all that. That was great. And
So what went wrong?
Philosophical differences.
We may have to discuss that with drinks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still, basically, I mean, all of my team left around about the same time that I left. And they now have, interestingly, they ended up commissioning Mavis and Van Dersen to design a new identity, which they'd been long planning. I mean, I was planning it while I was there, which I think is a great choice. I'm their friends, and I'm a big fan of them. And I think it's always interesting to see Dutch design operating in an American context. And they have a new design director, Dylan Fraccaretta, the art director of Pinup, who is a colleague of mine at RISD. And they've just commissioned Johnson Markley Architects to do a new reimagining of the space. So super interesting stuff going on, and young designers working there now who I know and who I still get nice emails asking for advice. And and I'm actually starting work on another book that's through various connections tied to the MCA. So it's still, it's all cool. It's all cool. Yeah.
But as we have discussed previously, we both were thinking that in fact what they have at the Walker Arts Centre then with sort of design kind of sewn into the very DNA of the institution is a very rare thing.
Absolutely.
As it turns out.
I mean, that was definitely part of the temptation, a Midwest Art Museum, awareness of what Walker was doing, what Andrew and Emmett and all of those guys. And kind of my ambition going to the MCA was just even to attempt to head vaguely in that direction of what they were doing, which is kind of, design is really part of it. I mean, design's part of the collection at the Walker, so it's already at this certain level of hierarchy from the beginning. And, inspirational figures like Andrew, who's, operating as a curator, education director, designer. And I think that was the MCA's ambition too. They actually talked to Andrew in writing their job description, which is, when I received that job description, I could tell that, I didn't know at the time that Andrew was partly behind it, but I could tell, like, okay, they sort of know what's going on when the way they've described design's possible role within a museum.
All right, well, for more
So,
details,
yeah, it's a good theory.
get you at the bar. But let's take a couple of questions from the audience before we go through that. Is there any students first? Yeah, Justin.
Hi, can you talk about your motivations for using co-creation as a tool in your practice?
Yes, that's a very good question. That's something I always, I'm acutely self-critical and aware of, sort of these boundaries of, particularly because I've even written about pastiche in terms of other designers and how they've treated, say, the work of Gordon Matta Clark and other people. So it's kind of always this line I'm treading or balancing on between homage, reference, trying to avoid pastiche. Sometimes pastiche can be used, can be employed for particular motivations. But what I'm always trying to hope for is ultimately work that references and acknowledges in an appropriate manner where relevant, but not, devolving into retro or pastiche. So it's always something. Sometimes I find myself not being able to help it. Sometimes it's just purely designer humility. I often see, if I know I'm going to use a B symbol, like a pictographic B, then Paul Rand's already done the best one, so why would I bother redrawing it? So I just borrow that one and tip my hat or add apologies. And so, yeah, it's always, for me, ultimately, it's just, again, this joy that I mentioned at the beginning of a design practice being a constant education and not just stopping when you graduate. And part of that enthusiasm is I sometimes can't help myself with it spilling into various manifestations and borrowings in my work.
Yeah, how does your practice inform your teaching, and how does your teaching inform your practice?
Well, I'm very fortunate at the moment. Well, I've been fortunate all the time. I've never actually had a regular teaching gig, but I've had sort of the year I was at the Werkplatz, that was quite regular. I was supposed to be there 2 days a week, and I ended up being there most of the time, the way that the Werkplatz works. And I was also visiting monthly at ECHAL, and then now I'm just more sporadically, about 4 or 5 times a year, I go to RISD. I always have a nice cohort of just 5 graduate students following their thesis work. And for me, it's really, the answer is that each heavily informs the other, and it's often, my teaching relies on my own experiences, and that's kind of what I bring. It's often my own insecurities or questions. I bring that to my students, and for me, it's an opportunity to talk about the practice in general in a way that I don't find myself being able to do just in the day-to-day studio, trying to just get all the deadlines met and working myself like crazy. And I have been fortunate at ECHAL, at the Werkplatz for sure, and definitely at RISD, being in this perfect, what I kind of see as a perfect academic situation where it's mutually beneficial. The students are always putting me onto things that I haven't read, and I'm hopefully putting them into things that they haven't read, and it's just this always an equal conversation where they can help me out with certain things and I can help them out with certain things. And for me, that's a real joy to be able to be paid to spend time at a place like RISD and just have that kind of situation happening.
I'm just curious whether you had done any work with motion graphics or animating your work. It looks as though it could do really well in a moving context. I wondered if you tried that.
Actually, my very first commission when I left the Royal College was for a title sequence for a television program for Channel 4. It was a 6-part series by Alain de Botton, who was not very well known back then, which is why the likes of me, as a recent graduate, got the job to do the title sequence, which I did using cut-up bits of Super 8 footage that I'd been shooting the whole time I was at the RCA. So it's funny, after that I kind of felt like, well, this is perfect. I wanted to do motion graphics, I wanted to do installations, books, I wanted to do everything, so I felt like that was going to be my trajectory, and I somehow haven't ended up doing that much motion work. I've designed some animations and titles for the Tate here and there for some of their projects, but I'm glad you say that, because it's definitely something I would like to do more of, but haven't found the opportunity. I love animated GIFs. I make animated GIFs sometimes. That's kind of, that was like the only way. I was vehemently anti-Flash right from the beginning when I graduated. I graduated at the height of Flash, where you had to endure a logo doing a dance for you before you could visit a website in the late 90s. And I would always do animated GIFs because that was like a perfect, quick to load thing. And I'm really pleased that in the last 5 years it's kind of come back again. So but I would like to do work beyond animated GIF too. That would be nice.
As has an interest in brutalism. So.
Yes, indeed.
Well, listen, I can't promise you guys cherries on the decorative cherries on the Modernist Sunday, but we do have some wine and cheese. So I hope you'll continue the conversation with us next door in our reading room. But before we move, please join me in thanking